It was between not acting anymore and going to Harvard Law in 75. There was quite a bit of life because I didn't know what to do when my career was over. When Broadside was over, and I was afraid that now everybody knew I was gay, and I hadn't told my parents, but I still wasn't telling anybody. I thought, well, I'll go back to UCLA. I had been in the student council. I had been, I knew all about the student organizations. Maybe they would hire me back at UCLA. So I went back there, and they did hire me to run freshman orientation. And then they hired me in the office that advises student organizations in the late 60s. I was hired in 68 or 69. So the organizations that I was given to advise, the SDS, the Progressive Labor Party, the Women's Liberation Front, the Black Student Union, MECHA, they didn't want any advice, I'm telling you. But they started sort of coming around my apartment late at night, talking about the revolution, talking about race, talking about politics. And finally, they gave me some good advice. And they said, look, some of us are going to go to law school because as much as we are doing revolution, it's the law that has to be changed. You ought to go to law school. You're smart. You ought to go to law school. So I thought, well, I don't know what I'm doing with my life. I'm just here at UCLA, and as they told me, no woman's ever going to be chancellor at UCLA, which to this day is true. So I thought, well, I'll take the LSAT. And I took it, and I did really well, because tests I could take. And I thought, well, I'd like to stay at UCLA, so I applied to UCLA, and I didn't get in. And I only applied in 74. And the reason I didn't get in is because during the Vietnam War, all the grades at colleges became inflated by 1 point. Because if you flunked out of college, you were drafted. So all the professors who didn't want to have anything to do with making people go to war changed all the F's to D's, all the D's to C's. So I graduated in 62 with a 2.9 overall, which is less than a B average, in the top 10% of my class, because grades were really tight. During the war, everything went up a point. So I was working at UCLA. I didn't get into UCLA Law School. I was devastated. And a man who I think is my guardian angel, because I've only seen him at very, very important moments in my life, came to me with a study that showed that because of grade inflation, my 2.9 was worth 3.8, the same as a 3.8 now. And he hands me the study that was a UCLA study. And he said, here, go apply to some other schools. So I got into Harvard, I got into Yale, I got into Berkeley, and I was turned down again at UCLA because they didn't take this grade inflation stuff seriously. So I said, you guys are nuts. I'm going to Harvard. So I had a whole career, actually, in administration at UCLA during the student revolution and the beginning of the women's movement. And so much was going on campus. It really informed my politics in a way that my own generation had not been informed. It was really much more about what's happening, what change is needed. And it turned out to be a very wonderful thing when I went into politics later, because I sort of had this attitude, things needed to be changed. And also when you grow up gay, you're already outside the box. So you think outside the box. And both of those things helped a lot. So I did. I started law school in 75. I was very interested in women's rights. It was just beginning, at the beginning of the 70s. We helped open the Women's Resource Center at UCLA. We had the first sort of gathering of speakers where, Gloria Steinem came to speak, and a number of the feminist thinkers of the time were our speakers, and they really kind of informed the way, especially women, were thinking like we had suddenly woken up, certainly my generation. And you began to see it a little bit on television. I mean, it was interesting, a little bit, but people were still making fun of feminists. They were still making fun of women who wanted to do something outside of the home. Things were really roiling, I think, in television. Edith, where in All in the Family, what the characters were like. She, a kind of traditional but feisty, but traditional. wife and, the daughter, who was much more mouthy. Things were changing. And I was really interested in women's rights, but when you start law school, you mostly don't know what you want to do. I was 34, which was very helpful because I already knew who I was. I thought, I'm a good person. I don't have to worry about that. They're not going to change me. A lot of my colleagues who were 10 years younger were worried that law school was going to turn them into some kind of idiot, lawyer. So I loved my time at Harvard. I won the moot court competition. I was only the second woman ever to win that. There are competitions, national and international, where you prepare and argue a Supreme Court case. Not a real one, but one where they give you something that hasn't been decided yet, like they might give you, Prop 8 last year, or DOMA, or the changes to the Voting Rights Act, and all the stuff that was just decided at the time that we're speaking right now. And you prepare, you have a team of students, and you prepare, and you argue, and you write a brief, and you generally, there's winners and losers, just like in the courts. Harvard, being Harvard, has its own moot court competition, which is supposedly very prestigious. And because I can talk so good and because I could think pretty well, one of my classmates wanted to put together a moot court team for the second year and asked me if I would be one of the oralists, which is one of the two people that actually argues the case to whoever is pretending to be the Supreme Court. And we generally, as you go up through the ranks, if you get into the semifinals, finals, there are only two teams. We have real Supreme Court justices at Harvard that hear these things. The funny tie-in, actually, with Harvard and the moot court argument is that the night of the semifinals, where we won and we're going on to the finals the next year, was the night that I had to board a plane to come back to LA because we were doing the Dobie Gillis reunion movie. So I show up on the set with no sleep. I mean, I can't sleep on planes. And it was, talk about going from world to world. It was pretty amazing. It was fun to see the guys, but it wasn't something I wanted anymore. I was just willing to do it because I really felt a kind of an obligation to the show and to my character. Every time I did something different in my life, People magazine would write an article about it. Zelda goes to Harvard. And then when I started being a law professor, Zelda lays down the law at law school. And then when I ran for office, Zelda leaps out of the closet and into an assembly race. So thanks to People magazine, I never had to tell anybody anything that I was doing. In my third year, in the spring of my third year, the finals of the moot court argument occurred. And the Thurgood Marshall was our Chief Justice. And then they had the presiding justice of the Supreme Court of Massachusetts as his second, and someone from the circuit court in that area as the third. There were three judges hearing the case, but he was the chief judge. There had been other judges. Every year at Harvard, there's always a Supreme Court judge or justice that heads up their oral history project. So the argument that we were briefing and then had to make was about a young woman who had run away as a minor to join a cult. And her parents saw her on the street, and they kidnapped her. And they put her through some kind of deprogramming like they used to do with people who were in cults. But she was an adult by the time they kidnapped her and put her through this. So the question was, did she have a constitutional right not to be put through this? And we were representing her. And so I made the argument, and my partner making the oral argument, made his half of the argument, and I did the rebuttal. The rebuttal was all, as I recall it, citing St. Augustine. I don't even remember why. I think it was because he had said a person should defy their parents and follow Jesus. even if they were defying their parents. And so I was citing him as not only constitutional law, but general historical law that a person could defy their parents. So the 3 justices leave the bench. They decide who's going to be named the best oralist, which is the highest honor that you get in moot court. They came back, and Justice Marshall announced that it was me. And he came down off the bench, and his hands were very big. And he took my hands in his, and he said, "Lady, I like your style." That is a great memory for me.